have arrived at Purgatory Station. You have arrived at Purgatory Station. This service terminates here.
I then stood inside a room of bleak interior, all bare concrete walls and floors, cold and damp. It was an open-plan living room with an open kitchen. There was nothing in the kitchen but mouldy wall tiles and green, mildew-stained cupboards. Even the fridge was empty, except for half a bottle of curdled milk, filling the fridge with a heavy stench of lactic acid. To the left of the kitchen was a short wall dividing the kitchen from the front entryway, which opened right up to the living room. All the way down the front door hung heavy chains and multiple locks. I made my way over to it and flicked the light switch by the door, causing an intermittent flicker from the ceiling light before illuminating the place with an eerie, soft glow. Dust formed helical swirls in the air and a single moth circled the bulb. There was an atmosphere of unease and strangeness. The whole interior space was like some sort of chamber, a cell, a decaying shell cut off from the real world. A place in which all bad memories had made themselves feel at home. A desk was against the wall, which must have been a new setup as I'd never seen it before. In fact, this is where his easel normally was, but no easel was in sight.
Nor was there any sight of James. I inspected the whole place, but he wasn't there. How could he have left if the place was locked from the inside?
On the kitchen island were 3 envelopes with the letters still inside, all addressed to him. I picked them up and made my way over to the desk, which was littered with screwed up pieces of paper. A little out of character for someone usually so meticulously neat and well ordered. More interestingly, there was a microscope linked up to a laptop, but the screen was off. I was surprised and confused to see such equipment in his possession. I guess he must have had some kind of secret hobby. After inspecting it, I could tell it was a digital LED trinocular compound microscope, the kind that includes a digital imaging system and is used for examining clinical specimens. An asset label was stuck across the side, and written on it said, "Microscopy, do not remove." I remember thinking, what the hell was he doing with equipment like this? Taking out the wooden chair from under the desk so I could sit to read the letters, something rolled off and fell to the floor, wobbling towards my feet. It was a hand-painted wooden nesting doll, an unusual object to have lying around, I thought. James didn't seem like the kind of person who collected antique toys. The outer doll was now broken, a hairline cracked through its delicately painted face from the eye down to the split in the middle. There came a fleeting moment of reminiscence as I remembered the day Dad may have given something like this to James as a present when he was younger. Out of the few possessions James owned, this must have been the only one connected to his childhood, since he owned no photographs. I placed the doll on the desk and proceeded to look at the letters. The first one was from the landlord giving a final warning about overdue rent. The second letter was dated January 25th, but wasn't from the landlord. Dear James, thank you for your request to have the Juried Art Exhibit Committee review your submission. This year, the jurors had over 700 works to consider, and after much deliberation, the works of 12 artists were selected for exhibition, a total of 65 pieces, by a jury panel consisting of 3 faculty members from the Visual Arts Department. We appreciate the opportunity to view your artistic work. However, it is with regret to inform you that we're unable to offer you an exhibit at this time. We'd like to thank you for your time and interest, and we encourage you to submit your work again in the future. If you have any questions regarding our juried selection process, please feel free to call our office at the number provided below. Sincerely, the Juried Art Exhibit Committee. I did a quick lighthouse sweep of the room and saw, tucked away in the shadows, something draped in white. I knew very well what it was, but didn't feel like uncovering it to confirm my suspicions. Instead, I pretended it wasn't there, and with my back fully turned towards it, I moved on to the third and final letter. Dear James, thank you for your request to have our jurors review your submission once again, but unfortunately it's not been selected this year. We hope you will apply next time and wish you continued success in all of your creative endeavours. Sincerely, the Juried Art Exhibit Committee. James didn't always respond very well to criticism and must not have taken this letter lightly. I just had the worst feeling, like something terrible might have happened to him. For a brief moment I sat there, wondering where he could have disappeared to. As I did this, I broke each doll in half, removing the smaller one from inside, and lined them up neatly next to each other on the desk. 7 in total, but I noticed that something was seeping through the split of the last one. viscous dark liquid all over my fingers. Curiously separating the two halves, there appeared to be a small piece of foul-smelling sticky substance of unknown origin. I'd never smelt something so obscene. The pungent odour stung my nostrils. I couldn't even guess at what it was. Maybe a small animal or insect or specimen of some kind, left to go bad. Whatever it was definitely rotten and decayed, and well beyond recognition now. The desk appeared to be some kind of workstation for research of some kind. I rummaged around and found a pocket-sized leather notebook underneath some of the scattered notes and papers. Some blank, but some upon which were many writings, though nothing I cared much to read, as it all seemed unordered, but the notebook, or what appeared to have been a journal of some kind, stood out as perhaps a more logically consolidated logging of thoughts and writings, and so curiously I thumbed through the pages. What was written inside varied from single words and random sketches to pages and pages of entire paragraphs and lined notes. But while flicking through, something caught my attention amidst everything. I had to go back a few pages to find it again. It was a lemniscate, etched crazily into the page in thick black ink. As I traced its figure-of-8 shape, it crystallised in my mind, and I pondered the significance of it in this book and why it was drawn in this way. Even though it was a familiar symbol, I got the impression it stood for something more significant, perhaps even sinister. Some pages before it were many haphazardly scribbled notes, mostly illegible. A few pages after that was more writing, which I managed to read more easily. It was a diary. Each entry was recorded with the date. January 25th. Today, I received a letter from the gallery. The sculpture I submitted has been rejected. Everything I've been through, everything I've worked so hard to accomplish, was all for nothing. The essence of art is the connection it makes with the person looking at it. It's a two-way conversation, but that person must be willing to participate, otherwise it's as good as dead. That's the problem with today's audience. They're too passive to engage with something on an emotional and intellectual level. I may as well give up. I'm just wasting my time. The beauty of nature that once inspired me is now so dull and ordinary that my mind, once thriving with ideas, is now a hollow and desolate place. I can't sleep. I can't eat. There's no longer anything left in this world to create that is original, not even new interpretations of pre-existing ideas. So what is the meaning of my existence, if it is not to bring something new and organic to the eyes of my audience? If my art is dead to others, then I may as well be too. A lump grew in my throat and a tear formed, for I started to fear the worst. January 30th. Quite possibly, I've been hallucinating due to a severe lack of sleep, but I've begun to see patterns everywhere I look, in the walls, inanimate objects, patterns in their various marks and imperfections, everywhere, all around. I see an endless number of things within them. After being isolated for so long and staring at the same blank walls, I've had sort of an epiphany. I think I need to look into deeper places for inspiration, further than the naked eye could ever reach. Today, I had an incident involving the crafting knife. While refining the sculpture I made, the only thing that keeps me company these days, something caused the knife to slip and cut my palm. But as I stared at my own hand, blood gushing out of it, I became distracted by the pattern of my own skin. I was able to forget about all the pain and the blood. It was then that I noticed that while skin cells are invisible to the naked eye, and we only see the tissue they form, looking closely as I have, they contain a detailed structure and arbitrarily small scales. A fractal geometry, every particle in its place, part of something bigger, a network, God's flawless design, living art. There are fractals all around us, in leaves, crystals. I never thought about them before, but now I can no longer observe anything without imagining what their imperceptible anatomic structures might look like. Their DNA, the patterns within patterns. I want to see them all. Who knows what artistic possibilities they may inspire. January 31st. The microscope I took from the lab was difficult to obtain, but a risk worth taking. It might just help me see them a little closer. Since I've had the microscope, I've become totally infatuated with assessing the degree of complexity within the beautiful recursive patterns of objects. I experience such a perceptual and physiological reaction to them. The microscope offers the greatest magnification power I've ever seen. But the patterns are all the same across different scales. I've measured their dimensions, shapes and details, but I've reached a point where I can look no further. I need to go deeper, on a molecular level. It's the most therapeutic thing. If only I could go on doing it forever. Then I had an interesting thought. These recursive patterns are even within our own bodies, in every cell and structure of our internal organs. The brain, for example, contains the most complex patterns within its neuroanatomical architecture. I may need to observe them for myself, but what I really need is a good sample and access to an electron microscope. There were notes on the process of excerebration, scribbled diagrams of the anterior cranial bone located between the eyes, through which the brain can be removed. The hippocampus, the temporal lobe, the cerebral cortex. My stomach went into tight knots. February 3rd. The brain tissue sample I acquired won't stay fresh for long. It's already beginning to decompose. I have stored it safely inside a wooden nesting doll, where hopefully it will be protected by its outer layers until I find something to preserve it in. Except I have nothing to preserve it, and in any case the sample would require ultra-thin sectioning, around 800 times thinner than a human hair. I'm desperately trying to see this through, but I don't have the resources. It looks like my endeavours have come to an end, and I don't know what I'll do next. None of what I had just read made any sense to me. February 6th. The dream came to me again. I was standing in a massive empty room, and on the wall in front of me was displayed a giant blank canvas that took up the entire wall, on display like an enormous piece of art, except that it resembled the grey wall of my own apartment. I was a diminutive, insignificant being inside a vast theatre the size of an aeroplane hangar, perhaps bigger, for I couldn't see either end. It was almost like looking outside through the window of my own mind. All of a sudden I heard a voice echo from behind me, and although the words were not clear, the voice sounded like Dad. And I remember when I turned around, the other side of the room carried on for so long I couldn't see where it ended. There was a moment's hesitation as I faced a black, empty void, but I slowly walked towards the voice. As something in the distance became visible, a figure, or something just barely within view, my legs carried me faster and faster, but as I ran, I experienced a sort of spatial warp where the distance ahead of me seemed to both shrink and extend at the same time, while the voice became more and more fragmented. Upon finally reaching the other side, the voice had disappeared entirely, and I was faced with a large, old-looking mirror on a wall. But the strange thing was that my reflection wasn't there. Did that mean I have no soul, or that my soul has left my body? For a brief moment I think I saw Dad's face in the mirror, but it was gone before I could even hold his image in my memory, and I was left staring into a receding void, like a tunnel in the wall that I could reach into, unsure of where it might lead. I pressed my open palm flat on the cool glass surface of the mirror to see if this was really an illusion or not. As I closed my eyes, I sensed tiny vibrations on the glass. These vibrations got stronger until they were rippling all along my arm, and I started to feel an intense pain in the centre of my head. I tried to remove my hand from the glass, but it was stuck. I pulled with all my strength when suddenly the glass shattered, fragments of glass sprinkling through the air and landing like diamonds at my feet, and the voice called once more, only more clear this time. It called me into the infinite dimension. Subsequently I felt a sort of abstract happiness which was hard to explain. Then everything suddenly faded to black, and I found myself in the exact same room again, where the entire dream replayed itself, except each one was a degraded version of the one before. When I finally felt like I'd awoken from the dream, it seemed like I'd been gone for days. The infinite patterns, dreams within dreams, everything's limitless, endless. If I were to believe that dreams were a way of calling me, was Dad really speaking to me in the dream? Am I being called to some higher purpose? What's the connection? What does it all mean? February 7th. Last night I had that same dream again, except the mirror was no longer there. I've been on my own staring at the walls, but now I'm finally starting to see clear in the dark. The past is behind me. Something new is beginning, and I'm about to find out what. For the first time in my life I feel hope. A fourth letter on the desk caught my attention. Dear James, You had agreed to allow our qualified clinical staff to carry out a range of assessments which enabled us to assess your suitability for the participation in this clinical trial. Phase 1 of this trial is the first time that an IMP is tested. We have investigated the safe dose range and potential side effects, how it is metabolized, and whether it might work in patients. It is a non-addictive formal drug and can have very therapeutic side effects. As a medical trial volunteer, you play an important role in the development of this new drug. Also, by taking part in this, you may be one of the first people to benefit from a new treatment. I had a terrible feeling about this. There was a sudden change in the ambience of the room. In the corner of my eye, the sheet covering the statue dropped to the floor. That familiar gaping, unhinged mouth and tiny holes stared coldly forward like it was watching me. Frozen still, I stared back as an ice-cold shiver reverberated up my spine. The diary continued. It's truly remarkable how life begins. Out of infinite pre-existence, we simply come into being, and we exist. By their own free will, subatomic particles organise themselves into carbon-consisted molecules, which then interact to form cells, and eventually they combine to form organic tissue, resulting in, as if by some miracle, all the properties of life. But what about the soul? If there is such a thing, could it be that a soul has the ability to roam other realms and interact with our consciousness? As I read on, he talked about how he had been meditating regularly throughout the day, thinking of himself as something limitless, something that expands, and imagined that he was travelling through an immense and endless universe. He said he believed that we are two-dimensional shadows, unaware of the extra-dimensional world that produced them, outside our realm of consciousness, and that the dreams he'd been having, the dreams in which he'd heard Dad's voice, were the artifact of some higher dimension that he could not consciously perceive. While his physical eyes perceive only the physical world, his unconscious eye was perceiving the true world, a unified whole with an unyielding connection to the spirit. He'd felt his mind opening up to incredible new limits, and that its beckoning had grown stronger, and so had his urge to open the door. The very last thing he wrote in his diary. I couldn't sleep last night. I could hear something coming from the mirrors. It sounded hostile. I'm so confused, maybe I'm going crazy. It's getting louder. Abruptly I slammed the book shut. I couldn't stand to read anymore, and paused for a moment to try and process all of what I just read. A chill ran along my spine as I sensed a presence in the room. From somewhere in my peripheral vision, a silhouette or dark figure passing between the two walls of the next room. "James?" I called. "Is that you?" Cautiously I made my way towards the next room, and found myself between mirrors on opposite walls. I couldn't resist looking into one of them. There was no reflection of myself, just a tunnel of mirror reflections which receded at a curve, and at such a great distance that it felt as though I was staring into a void that stretched for light years. A strange calmness poured over me as I stared into this beautiful thing, and was overcome with the urge to shut my eyes. But before my eyelids could meet, here in this liminal space, and like a needle drop in the quiet, a distant voice called, and that's when I saw it. At the furthest point of the mirror tunnel, winding through the hollow portal, limbs flailing ahead of itself, stretching and reaching, its body twisting in a spiral motion as it glided weightlessly through this rectangular cylinder. It had the hydrodynamics of an eel, and as it approached closer it got larger, and I saw the face of James, its features elasticated and contorting into different shapes and lengths, and I saw it fast approaching from inside the opposite mirror. In an act of sheer panic, I made a bolt towards the now fully uncovered statue sculpture and lifted it high above my shoulders, surprised by its sheer weight. Its face was completely level with mine, and I could see the face had changed, the mouth even wider than before, eyes wider and more sunken, as though someone's fingers had plunged into the sockets. With all my strength I thrust it into the mirrors, shattering the glass. Letting it drop to the floor with a heavy thud, I sprinted towards the door, where I began relentlessly fumbling at the locks. So many locks.
I should have opted for the window as my escape route, but before I could make a run for it, branches of the tree began to come through, like crooked arms, as if some supernatural force was sealing off all the exits.
There was broken glass everywhere, and as I pulled hopelessly at all the chains, I looked over my shoulder. Something was coming out of one of the shards. Thin, fleshy tendrils stretched and twisted out of it, and slithered along the floor like meandering snakes, extending all across the room, some running up the walls and others spiralling towards the ceiling. Frantically, I continued to tug at the chains and try desperately to unlock the sliding bolts. I was a fly trapped in a web. Perspiration stung my eyes. The ends of the tendrils flicked and writhed, and soon the room was full of them, as though the whole place had veins, fleshy, pink veins, forming the inside of some giant organ. The bulb of the ceiling light began violently whirling around in circles, casting me in and out of light, and then an anguished groan bellowed as something approached from around the corner where the mirrors had been. These tendrils, they were all attached to something. It then emerged. An enormous mass with glassy wet skin that reflected strange colours, squeezing itself between the walls, making the sound of a thick, moist thump with each drag. With every long, burdened movement, anguished cries and screams came from something deep inside of it, as though something was trapped inside. Tendrils now began to dangle down towards me like they were alive. One of the tendrils slithered towards me, coiling itself around my leg. I froze still as it reached upwards, eventually wrapping itself around my torso and then penetrated my stomach, twisting itself into a coil, like a telephone cord, more and more until it was like a tightly coiled rope pulsating from the other end, as if something was being fed through it, a lump moving along at gradual speed. I stood there with this thing hanging out of me like an umbilical cord, tethering us together. As this thing emanated from me, I began to have visions of stars and endless galaxies, the far reaches of space just within my grasp. We were becoming one entity. The bulb went out with an abrupt but deafening pop, and everything was plunged into momentary darkness, and then...
Static buzzed on the television screen as the CCTV footage tape came to an abrupt end. The man leaned closely forward with his elbows on the desk and hands clasped together, studying intensely the frozen image on the convex screen of the television set. He was of a medical profession. Something was not quite right. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but something, somewhere in between the stuttering black and white pixels, had him fixed in a deep trance of perplexity and anxiety. His trance was interrupted suddenly by the approaching clamour of footsteps passing by, which came to a sudden halt outside the door of the next room. He shifted his gaze up through the window behind the screen as he observed the door of the next room smoothly and silently open. Room number 8. A fluorescent white light flooded the room, which was devoid of any sound or voice, and deprived of all colour and objects, except for a single painting that hung on the wall, and a single bed where the patient lay, unmoving and unblinking. Save for the light, there was almost complete sensory deprivation, and all around the room each wall was made of one-way mirrored glass, behind which were observation rooms. A smartly dressed man stepped into the room. He too was of a medical profession, and approached the bed where the patient laid perfectly still, eyes bulged open wider than humanly possible, so wide that the eyelids weren't visible. He brought his hand down over the patient's face and clicked his fingers twice to evoke a reaction, but did not get one. Not even a twitch or a squint, and the pupils did not even shift, just a vacant stare into some unseen abyss. Next, the man extracted a small black pen torch from the breast pocket of his coat and shone the light into the patient's eyes, examining the pupils, which were dilated almost to the point of not being visible at all. The eyes were of different colours. Congenital heterochromia. He placed the pen torch back in the pocket and adjusted his glasses as he traced the room intensely, observing it suspiciously in scathing detail. Besides a single crack through one of the mirrors which he had already seen, everything else seemed to be satisfactory. With that, he exited the room and shortly reappeared in the observation room where the other man sat by the television screen. He stood beside him and reached into his pocket, retrieving a small black dictaphone. Raising it to his lips, he spoke into it. February 9th, 2008. We had developed a new form of treatment which we believed to have massive potential for treating a wide range of mental health disorders such as PTSD and depression. Our primary goal has been to utilize the beneficial pharmacological effects of hallucinogenic agents. and to control and monitor their use in the context of a new cognitive behavioral treatment program. To begin the treatment, a microdose of the agent is first administered intravenously with a syringe driver that controls precisely the right amount over an exact period of time. We tell the patient to think back to the person they used to be, and the sort of person they may have wished to be. This is simply to encourage them to step away from negative feelings to break out of the box they've created for themselves. An object is used to induce a state of hypnosis. In this particular case, we used a painting to help the patient sink into a feeling of deep relaxation and warmth, and let go of all conscious thought. Once the patient is comfortable and restful, a personal item is then used to trigger the core traumatic memory, while brain imaging technology is used simultaneously to identify the brain's activity patterns involved in recalling it. Next, the agent begins to target the receptors in the brain that mediate such functions as memory and perception, and induces cortical excitability, which strengthens mental imagery, making the memory far easier for the drug to target. Our technology is then used to localize the physical trace of that core memory, which plays itself over in the patient's mind, while all peripheral memories associated with that same trauma are localized also. And as the drug floods those neural pathways, a detailed map of sparse neural patterns is created. In the process, the patient experiences a sort of virtual reality within the memory. This can be unpleasant for them, but it is necessary for the treatment to work, and is something we explicitly explain to the patient beforehand. Throughout this phase of the trial, the patient is confined to the same room, deprived of all sensory stimuli so not to be distracted in the process. From external rooms, we closely observe the patient as the agent gradually occupies the brain and interacts with that particular piece of cortex, forming a tether between them, linking and converging these memories. Over time, this neuron cluster is permanently destroyed and replaced with new, artificially created neurons in the hippocampus, restoring the patient's ability to form new memories again. It's like plucking a weed and having a flower immediately grow in its place. A quantum leap for targeted neuronal cell death, but what seems to have taken place is in fact something we completely did not expect. The patient has been under 24-hour surveillance since day one of trial, with periodic monitoring of brain activity. First reactions to the treatment were inimical, to say the least. Once the core memory had been triggered, we witnessed a frighteningly severe state of cataplexy, extreme paranoia, somnambulism and isotrophobia. He even made an attempt to escape because it seemed he had forgotten his purpose here and feared we were trying to physically remove and tamper with his brain. But the patient also adopted an alter ego, likely to have been triggered by stressors during the memory anamnesis, except the two seemed to conflict with one another. What's evidently occurred during this phase is a gradual merging and distortion of autobiographical memories and self-identity, intertwined with invented scenarios. Shortly after the recorded post-phase 1 interview with the patient, we witnessed erratic fluctuations between the patient's beta and theta brainwave oscillations, suggesting that he was in both realms of deep sleep and wakeful consciousness. He then experienced an intense episode of sleep paralysis in which he displayed muscle spasms and terrifyingly strange vocal noises, the likes of which I've never heard from a human being. We are unsure exactly what has happened, but we were unable to break the paralysis, and the patient has been unresponsive and in a fetal position for the last 23 hours and 38 minutes. What appears to have happened? Gradual memory degradation, resulting in sudden retrograde amnesia. He was a former employee here at the centre, a security guard on the verge of dismissal following his suspicions of our practice here, and coerced access to restricted areas in our research facility. Our offer to him was of a mutual advantage, for him to be the participant in this trial, as compensation to us for his gross misconduct, which would have normally resulted in severe consequences, but also to help us help him, to give him a new start in life, and prove the drug therapy works. From the initial pre-trial screening interview, we managed to obtain certain information about the patient and the cause of his condition. His father and brother were killed in a car accident when he was just 7 years old. His mother died years later of a suicide attempt. No other known relatives. He said he was a prisoner in his own mind, so haunted by the memories and feelings of guilt that he had nothing to lose whether the trial was a success or not. Such adverse side effects are not what we anticipated at all, and it is truly disappointing to be reporting these results. We will continue observation through the night, but it would seem as though the drug was not ready for the phase 1 trial stage after all. He lowered the dictaphone and paused to reflect upon what he had just said. "What happens now?" asked his colleague, still sat at the desk, a puzzled expression upon his face. "We wait, for now," was the reply he got. After he left the room, the man was left alone again and turned back around to continue studying the image on the screen, in which the patient was sat at a table undergoing a scrutinizing screening examination. The next room suddenly went dark as the white light automatically went off. He rewound the tape, playing those last few seconds of the footage again and again and again. He fidgeted in his chair and scratched his head. It then became clear as he realized what he was seeing. He knew there was something that didn't quite seem right, but it was hidden in plain view, amidst the visual noise of the static that for a fraction of the second that flickered back and forth on the tape, both of the patient's eyes were the same colour.